fast approaching, and many new school projects are nearing their final exams. And she was once the president of Alaska's Senate. So what is Jan Fakes up to these days?
And now, live from the Channel 2 studios, the 5 o'clock report with John Tracy.
Well, when we come back, a Washington pilot learns that what goes around, fortunately, eventually comes around. All right, thanks, Maria. Finally, tonight, his wife may not fully understand it, but many Alaskans will. Washington State pilot Jim Wilson just spent a week in Alaska after an unusual reunion. When Wilson was just 17 years old, he flew solo from his home state of Washington all the way to Merrill Field. Wilson only had a student's license at the time. His engine quit once, and he got lost several times, but he eventually made it. Well, last week, 23 years later, he was reunited with the same plane when he bought it back from a pilot in the valley. Tonight, he's completing his original trip. Wilson is on his way back home with his 1979 Bowers flybaby.
I've got it deep down in my blood to come get this airplane, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm not really looking forward to the flight home, but I'll be a lot happier when I get back to Washington with it.
We should mention the FAA suspended Wilson's license for 3 years when they learned that he only had a student license in 1980. Since then, he's earned his license and has over 1,500 hours of flying time. That's it for the 5 o'clock report. I'll see you tonight at 6.
You're watching Alaska's news source, KTUU Channel 2, Anchorage. And now, Alaska's #1 news team. John Tracy, Maria Downing, John Carpenter with sports, and Jackie Purcell with the weather. This is the Channel 2 News Hour.
Well, from Washington to Alaska and back again.
Just ahead, a round trip that's taken 23 years to complete. Finally tonight, a big trip and an unusual reunion. 23 years ago, pilot Jim Wilson flew his open cockpit plane over 2,500 miles from his home state of Washington here to Alaska.
Well, he describes the trip as slow, aggravating, and dangerous, but as Jeffrey Hope tells us, it ain't over yet.
Fill the oil up and check the gas. It's just a plane to you and me, but not to Washington pilot Jim Wilson.
Actually, it almost made me cry to see it again. It was quite exhilarating to see it. It was, I haven't seen the plane for, 20 years.
It's a kit plane, a Bowers flybaby, light enough so that when Wilson was a teenager, he could roll it, loop it, even fly upside down. And when his parents moved to Alaska from Washington State, he thought nothing of following them by plane. He didn't have a radio, a heater, or a pilot's license, just a student license. And he almost didn't make it after flying through ash from the Mount St. Helens eruption.
And now I think back on it, it was probably one of the stupidest things I've ever did, because that's what gave me the engine failure in Canada.
23 years later, Wilson is no longer as reckless. He now has that pilot's license and 1,500 hours experience. He also has a well-paying job and 3 other airplanes. He also has a wife and 2 kids. But somehow it all just isn't enough.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of crazy. My wife didn't want me to come up here, My family down below all begged me not to do this, but I guess, I'm destined to, whatever happens, happens. When God says it's my time to go, it's my time to go. I can't really make them decisions.
So there's just something in you that says, I have to do this.
I have to try it, yeah.
Wilson found his old plane on the internet, and this noon, he began an attempt to turn his spontaneous, seat-of-the-pants teenage trip to Alaska into a more respectable round trip. That's how it is for some people. Sooner or later, they just have to finish whatever they start. Jeffrey Hope, Channel 2 News.
Wow. We should mention that Wilson's first trip here cost him a fine and a 3-year suspension of his license because he flew across the border. It's not allowed with a student license. This time he's legal. He says he expects to be home by this weekend.
And you better bring a lot of presents home, Alaskana, I guess, to your wife, because...
And he's got a GPS, so hopefully he won't get lost again.
Okay. From all
American troops could be on Liberian soil sometime today, but a U.S. official says it doesn't mean a large force is moving in. Alaska Senator Lisa Murkowski has some big names holding fundraising campaigns on her behalf. And it's Wednesday, and we'll be heading over to Allen and Peterson to find out what's cooking with Chef Al.
And now, live from the Channel 2 studios, this is the Channel 2 News Morning Edition.
A Washington pilot says he's driven to finish a trip he began years ago. Jim Wilson just spent a week in Alaska after an unusual reunion. When Wilson was just 17, he flew solo from his home state of Washington to Merrill Field. Wilson only had a student license at the time. His engine quit once and he got lost several times, but eventually he made it. Last week, 23 years later, he was reunited with the same plane when he bought it back from a pilot in the valley. Now he's attempting to complete his original trip. Wilson is on his way back home in his 1979 Bowers flybaby.
And I think I'll be okay. I've been flying a lot over the last 20 years, so I'm definitely not inexperienced. But the weather is a factor that's the main concern of the trip. And and the distance in between places to land is another concern.
The FAA suspended his license for 3 years when officials learned that he flew here on a student license back in 1980. Since then, Wilson has earned his pilot's license and has over 1,500 hours flying time. Wilson expects he'll make it home by sometime this weekend.
Stuckagin Heights residents worry about the city's wildfire evacuation plan after a new report reveals some problems. Plus, Alaska law officers and broadcasters joined together to get the state's Amber Alert system up and running.
And now, from Alaska's news source, this is the Channel 2 News 5 o'clock report, weekend edition.
A round-trip flight to Alaska has finally ended for one man 23 years later. On Tuesday, we told you about Jim Wilson. At 17 years old, he flew a home-built open cockpit plane from Idaho to Alaska. Well, 23 years later, he found the exact plane, bought it from its current owner, and came to Anchorage to fly it to Washington, where he now lives. 5 days and 35 hours of flying time later, Wilson has completed his trip. He landed at Moses Lake yesterday afternoon. He says the flight was good despite some minor engine trouble, and now that he has his plane back, he says it'll stay in his family for good.
My daughter's 2 and my son is about 4 weeks, so it'll be quite a long time before they actually get the opportunity to fly it if they want. But I'm never going to sell it again. I'll keep it till I die or whatever happens.
Wilson says after spending some time out of the plane, he plans on bringing it to air shows around the state of Washington.
And now, live from the Channel 2 studios, Alaska's weekend news source, this is the Channel 2 News Late Edition.
A Washington pilot has landed safely back home in a homemade airplane he built 2 decades ago. On Tuesday, we told you about Jim Wilson, who built a kit plane at the age of 17 and flew it to Alaska. Then he left it here. 23 years later, he found the plane on the internet and decided to complete the road trip, or the round trip. Wilson landed yesterday afternoon at Moses Lake, Washington, after 35 hours of flying time and 25 stops. He says the flight brought him back to 1980.
Places I had landed at were basically the same places I landed at when I flew it up there, so it brought back old memories. 23 years later, it's kind of hard to remember it all, but it did bring back quite a few thoughts that I had when I was younger.
He says now that he has the plane back, it'll stay in his family for good.